Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm George Blumenthal. I'm the director of the UC Berkeley Center for Studies in Higher Education, and I want to welcome you to today's presentation because we're really fortunate to have with us John Douglas, who will be talking about his new book, which is entitled Neo-Nationalism and Universities, Populists, Autocrats, and the Future of Higher Education. This book is published by Johns Hopkins University Press. It's now available in paperback, and if you'd like it as an open access book, it's also available as an ebook through Project Muse. So let me start by saying a few words about John Douglas himself. John is a senior research fellow and research professor of public policy and higher education at the Center for Studies in Higher Education, which is a part of the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. He's the author of several books, including The California Idea and American Higher Education, published by Stanford University Press, Conditions for Admissions, also from Stanford, the New Flagship University, Palgrave Macmillan, and Envisioning the Asian New Flagship University, which was a Berkeley Public Policy Press book. John is also the founding principal investigator of the Student Experience and Research University Consortium, sometimes called CIRU, which is based at Berkeley, which does surveys of students at research universities around the world. So with that, let me turn it over to John to say a few words about his own book.
Well, thank you, George. I really appreciate it. And thank you for those who have joined us today. It will be, I think, recorded and available on YouTube later on too, as well, if you think there are colleagues who might be interested. This is just to give a general kind of overview of the book. It was back in 2017, it's a while back, but I got a grant to help put on a conference on this topic. And I really took the approach that we needed case studies to look at individual countries, and then we could learn more from that by doing in-depth case studies. And then it took a long time to kind of get it all together, but we eventually, I was able to put a book together that includes, it's important to note, has contributing chapters with many of the case studies that includes Brendan O'Malley, Wilhelm Krul, and Thomas Brunout, who focus on the EU and Germany, Marijke van de Vende, who also looks at the EU side of things, Karen Fisher, who contributed about China, Brian Penbrass, who collaborated with me on Hong Kong and Singapore, Igor Chirikov and Igor Fedotkin on Russia, Elizabeth Balbachevsky and Jose Albuquerque on Brazil. And, it was an interesting thing trying to figure out which countries to include in this. And I have to say that, you can't do all the countries because it's neo-nationalism and autocrats and populists are all over the world and significant parts of the political global landscape. But we picked ones that I picked ones working with authors that I thought could contribute something that gave a kind of a broad look at some of the major movements and trends. We could have included others. So just to give you a little bit, let's see if I can get this going. Oh, I got to do the sorry, I have to do shared screen, sorry. All right. So just really quickly, of course, and I was just commenting to George about the ominous look of our cover, which I think is attractive to a certain degree in a kind of a sad way. But I think, as many of you know, neo-nationalism in its present form has historical roots, but there are really different trends that have accelerated the modern adaptation of nationalism, hence the name neo. One is the trends of globalization, which have changed the economy of the world and often displaced people and working in their jobs, created some economic instability for many people. And that's been a part of attraction of the new forms of populism. Also, that there's new forms of media control in terms of how messaging is given. We don't have the traditional forms of media in the same way that used to be a filter, and also the usage of technology for surveillance and these kinds of things. So there's a number of trends that have accelerated what makes populism different in this modern era. And the technology side is really significant, especially if you look at places like China. So anyway, we do see a broad trend. Now, it extends from what might be called truly autocratic governments or semi-autocratic governments from a Russia to a China to, trends that we've seen here in the United States and in England with the Brexit movement. Aspects of the Brexit movement are very much part of the neo-national landscape. Then we look at places like Hungary and Poland, which are what I think are terming, or most people term, as illiberal democracies, post-Soviet controlled states that had struggled towards a new form of democracy, and then neo-nationalist leaders have taken advantage of that and have then secured their own power structure. Turkey is a very interesting case study, and Brendan O'Malley does an excellent job in the chapter about Turkey. Very scary series of events for academics, and I should say for civil society in general. By looking at universities, my argument partly is that you get a kind of a canary in the coal mine, a place to look at a variety of things that can impact civil society and how nation states interact with the global world. In Turkey, after the coup attempt, oops, sorry about this. After the coup attempt, many academics, some estimates are up to, let's see, was it 8,000 or more academics were fired, as supposedly being in association with Gulen, who was the opposition force to Erdogan, and people being arrested and taking their passports away. And anyway, Turkey is a very important and upsetting story of shifting change in a nation state that, again, many in these patterns, whether it be Russia, China, there was a sense of maybe moving towards more open societies, but then there are various trends that lead to neo-nationalist leaders. China, of course, is also very important. Uses of technology is really significant in suppressing dissent and controlling what happens in universities or civil societies in general. I presume that many of you are aware of the social credit index, which uses face recognition technology to other forms of internet reviewing and understanding what's happening on the internet that the nation state can then use to punish dissent. So these are just some examples. So with these case studies, at least in this book, try to then say, well, what does it mean? I mean, how do we understand these different varieties of neo-nationalism, which have strong cultural, roots in specific countries? There are strong historical aspects to them. They're not all the same in any way. And that's one of the points, is there's a lot of variation. But I tried to make some sense and say, well, let's take a kind of a look at the range of neo-national movements and try to describe them. I didn't find much help looking in the literature and political science and other places so that I could adapt. So I just kind of created something that I thought was fairly a way of explaining it. And so I basically used this range of nascent populist movements, which you could say was the US to some degree, the UK, populist political parties that have strong representation, not just minority groups, but have a significant play in the political realm of a nation state, nationalist leading governments, illiberal democracies. So there's this range, and then really authoritarian. And I'm not saying that this is just a sketch, and the concept is just to get an idea of the range. It's not exactly saying exactly which group fits where, because there are contradictions in how they approach control of academic work, of immigrant visa policies for talent to come in and out, or related to refugees and these kinds of things. So this is just this kind of range. And then what I did was I said, okay, let's kind of look at the range of things that nation states do in this spectrum. And these are also not necessarily mutually exclusive. The concept kind of is that it's a soft neo-nationalism on the left, onto autocrats on the far right, and they accumulate these particular policies. But I'll note one important variation is that, for example, in Russia, there is obviously neo-nationalist tendencies. Putin is gaining greater and greater control. It's not to the extent we see in China, and there are different cultural backgrounds from this old Soviet state and all of these kinds of things. But they're not really anti-immigrant. I mean, they continue to bring in international students, for example, that has been traditionally part of the Soviet, at one time the Soviet sphere of influence. So there are nuances there as compared to a Hungary, for example, which is, I think we could say, a neoliberal democracy or bordering on it, or in the United States, which we had under Trump, significant international students, anti-immigrant policies that had large ramifications for American universities and our ability to recruit students internationally. Same thing with the UK. Then finally, my last slide here, just to try to say, well, these were my introductory chapters that then try to help create a framework for for analysis of these individual country case studies. And I looked at I tried to, and this is a theme I've kind of been working on for some time, and Mark Vendevinde has as well, when are universities really leaders in society, let's say change agents to some degree? No university, as I argue in the book, is outside the political spectrum or acceptable political world in which they operate. In fact, that's one of the really significant parts of what I try to say in this, is that, the political nature, the cultural, historical nature are really determinate as to whether universities can be leaders or followers. And as you can see, this tiering, the concept is tier 4 is the highest point. A university that does all those tiers in some form, including its ability to be a constructive, and that's a word, important word, constructive critical, or promote constructive critical analysis of society, when transportation systems are not working, for example, to higher level, like, do we have any form of representative government? Are autocrats taking us down the wrong road? It's kind of a range there. But in any case, so these are some of the frameworks that are offered in the book. So with that, George, back to you. See if I can get this off. Sorry about that.
Thank you, John. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask John some questions, but I want to encourage those of you out there watching to submit your own questions via the chat. So I may start with some of my own questions, but I'd really like to get to yours as well. So if you'd like to submit questions via the chat function, I'd be happy to ask John your questions and transition it from me to you in terms of asking questions. So feel free to submit questions as soon as you'd like. And so we'll continue. But let me start, John, by asking about what are some of the characteristics of neo-nationalism compared to past nationalistic movements? How do they really differ? John, you're muted.
Sorry about that. There's a long there's a long pattern of populism and nationalism, particularly with the kind of development of the modern state, which really most historians look at the late 1700s and in the early 1800s, this transition kind of through the Renaissance, but through feudalism into kind of the nation state. And with that comes identity of nationhood, and we see various populist movements. In the United States, there's a long history of populist movements, and they have different meanings, but they tend to have certain kinds of similarities, and that includes being anti-immigrant, particularly in the United States is a good case example in which immigrant groups continue to come in because the United States is a land of immigrants, and it causes various kinds of political backlashes. But what I would say is that the modern forms of neo-nationalism, as I said before, are really accelerated and changed by the significance of globalization in creating, a destabilizing, to some degree, economic world for many people and what they're working on. Then globalization as well, related to modern forms of demographic change, also creating instability and anxiety about status. These are, again, rooted in historical patterns, but it's really accelerated significantly. And I think looking at the EU and the crises in the Middle East and the refugees that had come from Syria and other places added to that kind of that form of nationalist movements. You have to look then and say, well, what about China? Well, China has its own isolation. It relates to a strong historical role of the state in controlling the world, the party controlling it. So in a way, and we say this in the book, and the authors do too, Russia and China have a different historical traditions. And in many ways, what's happening in China and what's happening in Russia are revivals of old structures of control, which are part of the communist, nationhood of the Soviet Union and Maoist China. But again, the paths of globalization go both ways. In some ways, China has benefited from globalization, but it has also used globalization and its power and its advancements in technology to create a stronger surveillance state. And I think that, we're crossing here a little bit, but the social media aspects of the world, which are not they're different in China because they're so controlled, but are also significant. And then this growth of technology and surveillance is also something that autocrats who have the capability, and China is really the leader in this, are really, taking advantage of this to reassert their power. So just as a relationship, you think about, well, Tiananmen Square, this was a significant, in the midst of a sense of growing, or at least a slight movement to a more of an open society and open market, Tiananmen Square, which had many students or university supporters engage. This has always been a significant worry of the party, that these universities, while we want them to help us develop our economies and make us competitive, we're also worried that they're potential sources of significant criticism that could gain popular support, that they offer, and this is often the concern of neo-nationalists, that universities are hotbeds of sedition, and that they threaten the state in some form. So the crackdown on Tiananmen, one could argue, really did have at least some, it gave an example, but also helped Xi come into power, and his pattern of exerting the state's control of academics and civil society has really, grown tremendously. And we're seeing it also bleed into Hong Kong now, with kind of this dissolution of this concept of one nation, two systems in Hong Kong. And that's also a focus in one of the chapters in the book.
Great. Yeah, thank you, John. What is the autocrats playbook in subduing universities? How does that work?
Well, I just posted a blog on that, and there's an article in the University World News, which is a section out of the book. It's just that it became very apparent in looking at these case studies done by Igor Cherkov and Igor Fedukhin, or Karen Fisher's look at China, or Brendan O'Malley's deep dive into Turkey, that there are certain kind of behaviors that are occurring. And in Russia, for example, it's almost a resurgence of political state control in a system, as they argue, that already has significant corruption in it. So it gets complicated. But basically what we're seeing is, beyond these kind of broad controls of, say, the internet, or what can be said on social media, or what can be said in public, there's a strong movement towards control of the governance and management of institutions. There was kind of a period in many parts of the world of creating greater autonomy for universities. They've kind of took this from the West to a large degree. What were the most successful universities in the West? Well, places like Berkeley have tremendous levels of autonomy, and that has been bled into policies all throughout the world, seeing this as part of the path towards creating more productive research universities, for example. But that offered a threat. Too much autonomy allows for criticism for the things that I said are the top tiers of what a really productive university can do. And so there's been a steady stream, whether it's in, as I said, Russia, Turkey, others, to control who is appointed rector. The governing forms of governing boards are being stacked with, for example, party officials in China. And this is happening in mainland China, but also now under this increasing control of Hong Kong, we're seeing the governance structures of Hong Kong's universities come in line to some degree with mainland China's controls. So that you have a majority, like most vice rectors or rectors are now party memberships. They were to some degree before, but now this is really, they've kicked out. Peking University is a famous example in which a somewhat independent academic who was president was kicked out and a party official was put in with no significant academic experience. And then that bleeds down to hiring of faculty, firing of faculty. The most extreme examples are in China, perhaps, in this internal controls, although Turkey is also significant as well. And you're punishing dissent. In China, many universities, it is alleged, have cameras in their classrooms. They have recruited students. This is again kind of like the era of Mao. Recruited students to tell on faculty if they say something that is somehow interpreted as against criticizing the party or the state in some form. And then there are also incentives in place for faculty to actually say positive things and not negative things. So in terms of in China, for example, and this is again a case where the ministry really controls curriculum to a large degree, controls what happens in the classroom or wants to control it. They've provided incentives for faculty advancement. It used to be all around rankings. You need to publish in X journal in order to, even get a bump in pay. Now they've included, if you write, they can be published, I guess, almost anywhere, positive reviews of the Chinese dream, Xi's thought, and these kinds of things. So that's part of the extreme examples. But there are all these other aspects going on in terms of control of the judiciary, taking over media outlets, whether it be Hungary or Turkey, and other kinds of broader examples. But this is one aspect. Universities are an important component, both for supposedly economic development and socioeconomic mobility, but they're also a fear factor for autocrats and populists.
Interesting. So John, in your interview with Johns Hopkins University Press, you made an interesting statement. You said all globalism is in fact local. And that's kind of a takeoff on the old Tip O'Neill statement.
Correct.
All politics is local.
Yes.
Would you like to expand on this idea or explain the idea that all globalism is in fact local?
Well, I actually wrote an article kind of on this earlier in the globalization process, shall we say, for universities. I don't know, I'm forgetting 15 years ago, 14. And I know others say similar kinds of things. But, it's important for us. We do talk about globalization, and we see significant patterns of convergence in, for example, university management, although I've just noted some exceptions to these, but we're seeing lots of effects of globalization. We look over our shoulders and look at best examples, whether we're looking at the UK or UK is looking at us and vice versa, these kinds of things. They're really significant. And I think that's been a significant component of scholarly research, policy research on universities, on other things as well. But, we really need to always kind of say, well, the nation state, the regional, local environment matters a lot. It tells you a lot about globalization, and we need to sometimes, make that deep dive to understand it. And I think I kind of feel to some degree, reading the literature on higher ed and globalization and these kind of things, there's these kind of broad things that are said without doing that work of doing case studies and getting down to the local regional level. And that we can learn a lot from that. And then you'll see that there really are significant differences in patterns of behavior. I mean, not that people don't observe it before, but I think it becomes a more thorough comparative way of looking at what is the impact of globalization.
Great. Thank you. Well, we've had some questions come in from the audience, so I'm going to start asking you some of those questions as well. Let me start with this one. Hi, John. What role do consortia such as the APRU, Universitas 21, etc., provide a mechanism for preserving academic freedom and enabling universities to be more leaders than followers within their nations?
Well, that's a good question. I don't pretend I know completely the answer. I think on the positive side, they do create networks of often leadership. A lot of these consortiums are like, the president of X university meets with the president once a year at a dinner or something like that. And then there's other work that they do that's very important. I'm not saying that, but there's a kind of a certain cross section of people that are interacting and influenced by these consortiums. And yes, I think they are very positive. They create ways for people to look at best examples. Perhaps, there have been joint statements about academic freedom. The Haifa statement, I'm forgetting the date of that now, but it might have been 2006 or something, was a joint statement at a time when a president of a university in China could actually put his or her name on a joint statement about academic freedom. And I think that's gone now. But those consortiums do provide an impact. How much they, protect academic freedom on the ground, I'm not sure. I would say perhaps, and this gets back to the point about what I call a kind of a political determinist viewpoint. It's not to exclude other ways of looking at universities, but again, the local, political, regional, national environment is really, really important. And so there are some, for many of these countries that are under severe attack or significant constraints, like a Turkey, like China, like Russia, I think these consortiums may enlighten others about the problems in these countries, but they're not significant players in retaining academic freedom. And I make the argument it's not an easy one, and others have it as well. Yes, universities can do things at the ground level to be more engaged with other with society in general, and many universities have only come recently to this idea of a broad range of things that they should be engaged with local societies besides research and teaching students or many other things major universities do. But there's this kind of range of things that you can really do, and we really need perhaps greater, and it's easy to say, and it's not going to probably happen, but you need greater leadership among democracies. Major democracies put pressure on different parts of the world, but that aligns also with just like Amnesty International's concepts of trying to, lean politically at the top level on institutions. But back to the consortium, I think perhaps, maybe they have a greater influence and on academic freedom, on institutional behaviors, kind of more in that middle ground where institutions aren't really in the midst of significant neo-nationalist autocratic governments. Then there's probably a lot more room for shared experience. I think one example to say that is that many institutions really didn't have clear statements or any statement on what academic freedom should be at their institution. How is it institutionalized as opposed to we're just saying it? And I know, George, this is something you and Robert May have been looking at, but I think there's been more of a movement towards creating, at least in those parts of the world that allow it, statements about what it means and how it can be reinforced to some degree.
Just following up on that, John, you presented a continuum of neo-nationalism, and a continuum from relatively moderate governments to very dictatorial governments. Is there a correlation between the impact of the government on academic freedom with the continuum that you described? Or to say it another way, is there a continuum of effects on academic freedom, and does it correlate with the kind of government that's in place?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the main conceptual ideas, and that's why, when I presented that one chart on the spectrum and its impact on universities, you can clearly see many things that we would say are infringements on academic freedom. Then there's institutional freedom, which relates to academic freedom. So, like, for example, do we have open visa or not open, but liberal visa policies to bring and attract talent throughout the world? And that's an impact of globalization. The world learned that to some degree, the United States had a head start and gained tremendously by our ability to bring the talent of the world here and come on visa. I'm talking, beginning earlier than this, but the 30s and up to World War II was really significant, obviously, with the exodus from Europe. But visa policies are fairly liberal and all these things. And also there's a path to citizenship is also an area that's now changing drastically. Like if you looked at Germany, academics in Germany had to be German. And most of the world, that's the case, and that's changed dramatically. So there's those aspects of academic freedom that are a little different than, say, can I write whatever I want to write about a country or make observations that are critical of the national government. So there are these kind of range of things. So looking at, again, that spectrum, you go to the autocratic side, they're actually punishing dissent. They're firing and jailing academics. And also often in that pattern, and this is the case that occurred and it is still occurring in Turkey, this is what they call kind of a civil death, or this is a term that Brendan O'Malley brings up that's discussed in Turkey, is that once you're fired, your passport is often taken away. You're kind of blacklisted. You can't find a job. So this is really significant impacts on academics. And you just have to wonder, what is the future of universities in the near term or long term in places like Turkey? It's just decimated. And it's a complicated story of the coup and these kinds of things, and the rise of Islamic, influence with Erdogan. So there's a lot of complexity to that story, but that range sits there, and it's really have a huge impact on also talent mobility as well.
So one last follow-up on academic freedom really quickly. One aspect of academic freedom is the ability of faculty and researchers to choose the areas in which they do research. In some countries, there's an attempt to have considerable government influence on what research is done and what is kind of ignored. Does that correlate strongly with neo-nationalistic tendencies?
Yes, it does, but there are more extreme cases, like things that don't fit the conservative ministries or the conservative government with its ministries. A reminder for Americans that ministries of education rule the world, rule higher ed to a large degree throughout most of the world. In the United States, it's a little different. But you see these extreme cases, gender studies, for example, being banned in Hungary, or research that doesn't align with climate change, which is also a pattern we see. Again, we don't see it everywhere. China is different, but in other parts of the world, there are new national governments or leaders or people in power that don't still see an environmental regulation and these kinds of things and research as a hoax or a waste of money and these kinds of things. Then you get into this more gray area that I don't pretend I really know completely how much is being controlled. This isn't just an issue about neo-nationalism and more autocratic leading governments. This is also a general issue of debate that's gone on in the United States and other parts of the world for a long time. How much research money is being directed specifically to specific things. And, like, is it, Jimmy Carter in the late 70s, hate to go back, but, he wanted to direct a lot of research towards energy. And I think, in retrospect, it was incredibly enlightening. But the next government that came in under Ronald Reagan nixed all that. And there's been a debate about how much should be very focused on specific areas within a larger framework of research funding. What percentage is really going towards development or very specific areas that political leaders and others, perhaps in industry, see as directly beneficial to economic development. So that's also an area. So I don't pretend I know completely what the research policies are and how much they're controlling, but I would assume that there is influence. I just don't know for sure if I can point to them.
Great, thank you. So let me turn to another question that was sent in. Thanks for the great book and talk. I'm interested in how COVID-19 affected these neo-nationalistic and populist tendencies.
Well, it's a story still playing out, obviously, but I think most of the analysis I've read and what I see, and I did ask we conceived this book before COVID-19. It took a very long time. It's great to work with a great academic press like Johns Hopkins University Press, but it takes a long time to get a book out through the normal academic channels, and there are various things that were going on. But as a result, most of this was conceived before COVID, but then we bled into COVID. And also, I wrote the chapter on the US and Mr. Trump, and, had the good fortune then to finish up the book after Trump had lost, so that I could at least say something coherent, I hope, in relationship to that. But in those case studies and what we see in most of the research that I've been reading and looking at, is that COVID has usually reinforced the patterns of state control and by neo-nationalist leaning governments, from autocrats to illiberal democracies, largely, and then down a bit. And that is, by limiting a group. Simple things like limiting meetings, how many people can meet, to these kinds of things, towards other kinds of senses of an opportunity to control dissent. So the concept generally is that it's reinforced and provided an avenue for even greater state control. And I mean, I think we've all seen, wherever we are, the state has played an important role in developing vaccines to, and it's not just in the United States or, the UK or in Europe. There's the Sputnik vaccine. There's a series of vaccines developed out of China, which also attests to their significant growth in scientific expertise and ability, and hoping to make a mark on the medical side of things, which they haven't done too much so far. So there's this, the role of the state has been important. So of course, this provides a significant avenue. And the example that Brian Penbrass and I point to as, it isn't a direct correlation, but it feels like the demonstrations in Hong Kong, the uncertainty that was brought out, and again, which is significantly led by student groups, faculty not so much, again, in this edgy role between being, increased control by the state and their jobs not being clearly secure. I mean, I don't think all academics feel that way. Those working in engineering might feel different than those who work in sociology, for example. So there's this range of things. But COVID, provided more ability for Xi's government to crack down on Hong Kong. And we've seen a series of things since the series of demonstrations that have cracked down on group gatherings, but also in governance structure of institutions. And of course, this the law of 2020. Why am I forgetting its full name? But the national law, I think it's called, in 220, that provides a range of abilities to arrest and punish dissent or control society. And this has led to, for example, student unions dissolving. They're not, the student unions at various universities were major players in the demonstrations. The actual teachers union being disbanded as well. So I'm sure many of the people watching know many of these things. There's been a significant crackdown in Hong Kong. And I do think that COVID at least was added to the environment that led to these significant policy changes in Hong Kong.
Right. Thank you, John. Let me turn to another question from the audience. Here's one. Is not the US an anti-intellectual society and prone to monolingualism?
Yeah. Well, that seems like a little bit two questions there, but what I would say is and I do talk a little bit about this in the section of the chapter on the US. Richard Hofstadter wrote a very famous book in the 1950s that related to the rise of McCarthyism and how to respond to what was then a form of nationalism that in the midst of the Cold War, and that yes, anti-intellectualism has been a significant component. This relates again in the modern era to Trump's use of this concept of the deep state, which relates to technocrats running things and being against him personally, but that there's this kind of overall distrust of expertise, and that's ranged up and down through time and with various examples. So there is a very strong tendency to that, and if you really dig back deep, you can go to things like, I don't know if some of our audience know about the Know Nothing Party, which was anti-immigrant in the immediate post-World War, Civil War era, to the populism in the late 1890s in the United States. A sense of anti-intellectualism and expertise also relates to this kind of who controls the state and who controls the banking industry and all of these kinds of things. So yes, it's a significant component, and we're paying for it to some degree. I mean, we shouldn't have total respect and or not a critical eye towards expertise in the world. I think Dwight Eisenhower talked about not only the military industrial complex in the United States, but also the scientific industrial complex. I can't get the words quite right, but that related to our increased dependency on technology to fight the Cold War and how dominant it was becoming, relating to some degree, George, as to how much it was controlling what research was being done at universities. So it is, and we're contending with it now. Obviously, it's emerged. Now, the other question relates to, that we're a monolinguistic world, and we are and we're not. If you live in California, the demographic shifts are significant. Ballots are in Spanish and things of that nature. But I know what so there actually is a lot of bilingualism and tremendous demographic change that is mostly really good in terms of its impact on society and these kinds of things. So, but I think they're pointing to the fact that, we used to require, or some majors still do, that students in universities learn, another language or, these kinds of things. And yeah, we have that issue, but it's a complicated story, as I said, because the demographic change is so significant, and that's where we're going. And just to add one of my favorite points always about looking at demographic change, which was shown in the recent census, but also has been shown in California for a long time, is the number of multiracial families and children. And this is changing the face of, well, it should change eventually how we talk about race, but it's a more complicated picture than that.
Great, thanks, John. Well, you've alluded to this before, but I think I should ask you a question about this in any event. Globally, what are the implications of neo-nationalism on the ability of students to study abroad, the exchange of students between countries?
Well, in the United States, for example, we've seen a downturn in the interest of international students, but that reflects two things. One is that we've gone through a period of, with the COVID, obviously, but also Trump's visa policies and anti-immigrant rhetoric was significant damage in our global standing. There's just no doubt about that. But there's also the case that, there are a lot of market shifts going on in higher ed. There are many more excellent graduate programs and undergraduate programs being developed throughout the world, whether it's Singapore or Hong Kong or China. So it's a much more competitive world. And the United States, a reminder for some of us out there, it charges a lot. And we've been using it as a cash cow, like the Australians were, and the UK to some degree. So it's a bit of a complex world there. But we've seen a downturn at the student level. You could say that in the UK as well, the Brexit world and the post-Brexit world. At one time, figure I saw something like 20 to 25% of all income for universities in the UK pre-Brexit came from international students. That's probably a certain kind of funding. I have to be a little careful with that, but it was a significant source of revenue for institutions. The Brexit deal, changed the nature of the market. The EU students, didn't have the same freedom to come to the UK, and they're looking for other markets to make some of that up. So that's having a significant impact. Then, if we get to talk about faculty or researchers, and it's a global market for talent, generally. Depends on the country, but in the United States, UK, places like that, it's a global market for talent for graduate students and international. It's not a state level or national level. I mean, that's still a significant player, but the institutions that are the most productive have, are bringing in talent from throughout the world. And we are seeing patterns of shift and change. Again, the visa policies and the anti-immigrant kind of rhetoric of the Trump administration, which is largely being reversed. So, there are temporal aspects to it. Then the question is, how does it last? How does it, linger, shall we say, is having an impact on patterns of where people are going. But as I said, there's a kind of a noise there with the COVID, and how do we assess that? And I think we have to wait a while before we know more. A key element of being a society that brings in talent internationally is the path to citizenship. It's not just visa policy. So that's also an important area. And I think the Biden administration is taking a more serious look at that. And we do know that the UK and Canada has been doing it significant, and New Zealand. Anyway, these countries are looking at each other. This gets back to this question about consortiums and how we're looking at each other about policies. And there's lots of innovation going on because of that interaction. So I think in the global talent area, that's really, there are shifts going on as a result of neo-nationalism.
Great, thanks, John. Let me ask another question that was sent in. Do you think the soft power versus sharp power distinction is also relevant to this subject? Where neo-nationalism explains the domestic dynamics, sharp power as the manipulation of soft power could explain it in IR.
In IR? International relations, sorry.
Okay, great.
Sorry. Well, I don't know how to respond to that completely. I have to think about it. Sharp power is influencing soft power. Yes, obviously, I would say. The key example would be China's policies. The One Belt, One Road policies is a significant player in usage of soft power, which has a sharp power background. It's it has the question is, how much is soft power and how much is sharp power? And I'm just using these terms. Sharp power I haven't heard as much, but if you look in China, the One Belt, One Road is an effort to align certain countries, and it ranges from obviously building dams, loaning money. Often though, guess who's building the dams? It's Chinese workers, but it's not a singular story on that regard. And universities are part of that as well, developing relationships with these different institutions that could include the exchange of students and these kinds of things. So, I think it's important to understand that the scale of what China is doing is significant in certain areas, particularly in capital construction and these kinds of things, loans, indebtedness, these kinds of things. But in other areas, the United States does much of this as well. If you look at US aid, it's really large. I mean, it should be larger, many will argue. And you look at the scale of things and the impact over time of soft power kind of ways of interacting that have a kind of altruistic feel to them, but often also have a very significant political interest. And, policies related to bringing students to the United States, the Fulbright fellowship program, which came out of the Cold War era. Scale is too small, I think. But in any case, we see that kind of relationship, whether it is in a democracy or whether it's in a illiberal democracy / autocracy in China. Soft power is, in fact, I would say, a derivative of the nation state's sharp power. I mean, there are objectives here that are being pursued.
Well, here's an interesting question that was sent in. Thank you for the somber global analysis, but as a perennial optimist, I must ask this. Are there universities and countries that are bucking this troubling trend?
Well, I have to say that it's not a great story, at least if we're talking about the extremes. I would, so there is a range, but if we're looking at the extremes, a great case study or one that we point to and has been discussed all over the place is Central European University in Hungary, essentially being kicked out, and it has this link with Soros and the Open Societies Foundation and this conflict with Viktor Orban and his party and his attempts to control. It's not like Turkey, it isn't there, but there is real, evidence of institutions trying to buck the trend and not doing so well. We're seeing crackdowns in Hong Kong. It's still an ongoing story. Maybe it'll even out. And I asked this question in the book, and I think others have too, how much, like in China, how much had to do with Xi gaining control, like, the anti-corruption policies that he implemented were seen by many for a while just to get rid of his opposition, or one objective was to get rid of his opposition. And then he would move back towards liberal policies, that reflected the earlier period of Deng and others. And that hasn't happened. And so we keep seeing this kind of process and examples that are not good. One that's more on the margin, but is being discussed right now is, and we say Singapore is kind of an illiberal democracy. It's an interesting city-state like Hong Kong, but if you saw this recent dissolution of the Yale National University of Singapore College, this is a discussion, well, why did this occur? It's still being kind of trying to be interpreted. It appears that perhaps it has political motivations about control of a liberal arts college in which there were other controversies going on about free speech and these kind of things. So there are ones that are not so good. Now, on the positive side, and this is one thing that is argued in the book by some of the chapter contributors, in, say, countries that are more in nationalist-leaning parts of the world, or where it's just a kind of a movement, a scary movement, but like in France, Le Pen. Universities, and the argument goes, can play a stronger role in promoting democracy, and that one of our primary responsibilities is to educate good citizens, people who will be participants in society in a positive way. And there's lots of data that shows that, but we can do much better at it. So I think there are institutions that are looking at that and striving in the midst of neo-nationalist movements, but neo-nationalism soft. And you get to the extremes, it's hard to figure out. It doesn't look great. I mean, I noted the China a lot, but if you look at the example of Peking and getting rid of the president there, I mean, what's the messaging going on there with all the other kind of structures? And that's what I said again, it relates to what is the political environment like, the larger political environment? What will allow universities to be leaders? And there's a range there, but it's not looking terribly good on the most extreme side. Turkey, what will happen with universities in Turkey? They're isolated. The academics are isolated. They have a rule, if I remember correctly from Brennan O'Malley's chapter, that only 2% of the academics can be international. I mean, so you're creating these isolated worlds. It's, kind of like old Soviet Union structure. Yeah, we don't see Turkey completely in that light. Erdogan is a little bit more complicated than that. There might be avenues for more liberalization of society in the next decade. I don't know how long Erdogan's going to stay in power. So that's my attempt at an answer.
Great, thanks, John. Let's going back more to the beginning of your comments. You talked about universities as being leaders or sometimes followers of the government that happens to be in place and of the society that's there. Would you like to say a little bit more about that? When are universities leaders and when are they followers?
Well, I try to figure this, I try to create a little, matrix or a set of criteria that I showed you earlier on, and it's in the book as well. And some of the authors picked up on it and kind of used it as something to talk about. And, I think most universities have these basic things that they do. They educate a talented labor force. They should, and this sometimes they don't, but should be involved in technological innovation that helps and engage in various forms for economic development. I say preservation and study of art, history, and culture, but that's a little difficult because there are some parts of the world in which there's only one interpretation allowed. In Russia, for example, there are very strong policies related to how you interpret World War II and what you say about Stalin and others. So the state is involved in interpreting history, and this is very Orwellian, and we all know this concept. And so there are ranges there as to what they're really doing. Anyway, I go through these other about, promoting socioeconomic mobility, and then on, research related to social problems that could be perhaps, in some range of allowability in neo-nationalist leading governments, to critical analysis of society. So I do this range just to reiterate that, and I put that as the highest because it's the most difficult and it's not always the most productive. Universities often develop lots of research that is critical of society that's totally ignored or is, that's constructive or meaningful. So, but it's a really important function. We also have examples of academic research that's been actually profound in terms of government policies. And so I won't get into the range of that, of these things. But I talk about that range, but there's a lot of nuance and things that go on. And there are lots of parts of the world that really won't allow universities to be, this gets back to the political determinist viewpoint, they won't allow universities to do a number of the range of these things. As I said before, hiring a faculty and the incentives that are provided to them and told what their jobs are is a really significant part of whether universities can play these different roles. And there are lots of things in place to make sure that faculty in China don't criticize the state government. I'm sure there's a range of things that are allowable, but there are really set rules. And then the important thing to understand is, yes, there are set rules. Yes, there are distinct punishments that could happen to you. Often they are, and we've seen it in various parts of the world, they're selective, or what I should say is they're random. They're random. Like, one person might be arrested, another person who did something even more egregious won't. But there's this kind of sense of a pall that's put over the academic world in which people live in. And so there's lots of self-censorship. Then to get to more extremes, there are actual pursuits by academic leaders, I should say institutional leaders, to suppress this various activities that would make a university a leader or a follower, and universities are used to just reinforce the existing political order to some degree. And that, I think that's a complicated story. It could range, from, China is attempting to bring in more rural students and try to have some socioeconomic mobility after decades of denying that it existed to some degree. And but they're trying to kind of create a certain kind of citizen. And so there's that, those are those ranges. You've got those institutional leaders that are actually, doing the work of neo-nationalist leaders. And Vartan Gregorian, shortly before he passed away, the past president of Carnegie Corporation, in his endorsement for the book, which I'm very grateful for, noted this, that we had examples in which institutions are really playing a significant part of reinforcing the social order, which all institutions do to some degree, absolutely, in the United States or otherwise. But the extremes in relationship to these more autocratic governments or societies that have very limited civil liberties. And Turkey is one. You'll see this control of the governing boards, the ministry that oversees, the Ministry of Council of Higher Ed, I think it's called, in Turkey, and it bleeding down and creating like lists of people that should be fired that are then implemented by leaders there. So there are lots of nuances to these stories, and I'm in, at least what I try to do is then take that and compute them to some degree and note the nuances and look at that follower or leader role.
Okay. Thank you, John, and thank you so much for participating in this presentation. And I want to thank the audience for also being so willing to submit questions, which we've been able to ask John. This is a valuable contribution to the literature. It's a book that really needed to be written. It's extremely timely. Again, it's entitled Neo-Nationalism in Universities, Populists, Autocrats, and the Future of Higher Education by John Aubrey Douglas and published by Johns Hopkins University Press. Thank you, John, for being with us today, and thank all of you for joining us.
Thank you, George.